It is 7:39. We're starting this meeting of the RTM Finance and Budget Committee. We're going to go through a couple of things today. We're not going to vote on everything today, only because we don't have a full team here. But the first thing that I'd like to have somebody move is acceptance of a Darien Foundation grant of $123,540 to the Darien Police Department for their boat. I will say that the foundation originally did the outfitting of that boat to begin with. So I have Warner moving and Beth seconding. So in this particular case, the foundation will be making payments for the directly for outfitting the electronics on this boat. As I said, when the boat was first put into service, they upgraded the boat at that time as well. Because they will make direct payments, we didn't need an appropriation from the Board of Finance. So this is just the Board of Selectmen, which approved this, and the RTM. We're secondary on this. So is there any discussion or questions on this? Seeing none, are we ready to vote? I'll wait till Werner gets back. Wait a little longer.
I'm back. I had to let my dogs in.
We waited. All in favor of this, raise your hand, say aye.
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 Bill, I heard you, I'm assuming. Then it passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to nothing. All right. Our conversation on this is going to be brief. The next thing is 2313, appropriation for $2,640,000 from the unassigned balance to fund the capital projects that otherwise would have been funded through the transfer from the general fund in the fiscal year 2024 budget. I know that on the agenda it says 2.5 million. As I was going through the numbers and reconciling, Jen and I caught this at the same time. The original amount that the Board of Finance was looking at and the amount that was in their packet was 2.5. They changed that to 2,640,000. And the new resolution has been issued to the RTM. Can I have somebody move this? I have Beth moving, and I need a second, and I have Werner seconding. All right. I'm doing some analysis, and I'll share this with you for our next meeting. But part of the reason why we're getting, we have this money back is that there's a substantial amount of funds that are being returned this year into the general fund. There's about 994,000 from the Board of Selectmen. Most of that is attributable to vacancies and some, because of that, lower healthcare costs. And then there are some offsetting expenses. Utilities are up, and the fee for carting away was up, but that was offset by we got more revenue on the other side. So we have about 994,000 coming in from the Board of Selectmen. We have about 2.2 million coming in on revenue. 1.2 of it is from the investment income, but there's some other things getting slightly more money from some of the state grants, and also some other small amounts that, again, I'll pass on to everyone.
It's not all just fees for pickleball.
No, unfortunately. And then the last part is the Board of Ed, who, even though they allocated $200,000 to pre-buy certain items on their equipment that they approved, and then and then reduce the amount of their total budget. They still had more, mostly coming in from ECR, but that number is actually higher because, as I said, they took about $200,000 to pre-buy, reducing the 24 budget. They also paid for the SSOs and the Director of Mental Health using their existing funds for the year. So part of that is also they had funds for budget control. They've addressed that by not having budget control next year. So they've modified some of their budgets. I should also mention on the Board of Selectmen side, there was a lot of vacancies, mostly in the police department. Some of it's also just the accounting. We accrue the town. We accrue for when we're negotiating the contract, and it goes into an accrual account so that when the union contract is completed, it's not as if it's an expense that wasn't accounted for. It was accounted for and put into the accrual. So that money is coming out to offset some of the additional incremental fees that we've paid. They've also added $100,000 as a line item in the police budget because my understanding is when they were talking about the police department, somebody asked Chief Anderson how much the police have been returning year after year. And Don responded, "Go ask Jack, he'll know the exact number," which is true. But I'll also add, whenever I talk about that, is they return money because on the town side, we have to have every position appropriated and in the budget. And year after year, the reason they're returning funds is that they've had vacancies, and the amount of overtime that they're giving is not offsetting the value of the people not being there, as well as the healthcare costs associated with that. So it's vacancies of why they give money back. Otherwise, it's a pretty tight budget. Anyway, are we ready to vote on?
Hold on, Jack. I just have a question. So, with all this money coming back, it seems to come back every year.
Yep.
Not as much, perhaps, but it always comes back. I don't know if it's a structural issue or people budgeting carefully. I'm okay with it, but you're around for a long time. Are these numbers pretty much what we expect every year, or were they higher last year or this year than we expected?
I think they're higher than what we expected. And when we actually get into the mill rate, the extra money that's there, but I'm saying over the last 3-4 years, these funds have been going into the general fund. The general fund, other than a special appropriation or paying down debt, can only be used for capital. It can't be used to offset operating expenses, which is why I liked that the Board of Ed took their extra money and paid things down out of their next year's operating expense, because that way it was a real reduction give back to the taxpayers. They're coming in higher. Some of it is just the difficulty in hiring police officers and some of the and teachers and other people in the education area. Part of it is that some of the grants are coming in more. But yeah, I think on the town side, because we have to have an appropriation before they can hire or do any of the expenditures, they appropriate for what they think they're going to spend. And then, you have things that occur during the year. As an example, we didn't use all of our snow expenses because it didn't snow. So now that partially offset some of the expenses in the transfer station. They've done some things there to encourage, because of a particular company, or are already at capacity at their transfer station. So they switched it over to Darien, which is why our disposal took longer, cost more, but we also got more tipping fees for it. So, but yes, this is high. And
Okay,
you know,
so it's reasonable to expect that similar things will happen in fiscal 2024.
yes,
I don't expect us to be short money at the end of fiscal 2024, because we always have money. Okay, that's the structure of it. I'm not arguing it should be different. I'm just pointing it out so we all understand how this comes about.
well, part of my concern is, if you're talking about, we have $160 million budget and we're giving back $4 million, that's over 2%. I understand that we could be off by 1%, 1.5%, but this is a very high year for that. And now part of it was just the change in investment rates, which yielded $1.2 million in incremental on investments. But at the same time, it was my understanding that Joan had requested last year whether or not she should recast the numbers, because when she did in November was much different than what the rates were in March. But the investment portfolio has also changed. We're doing much more in treasuries. We have about 24 mil in treasuries now. We're at 30% in stiff, which is higher than it was before. And the rates are higher. So even though I joked at our last meeting that we put our bond funds into Chase and they give bupkis rates to us, Joan sent me an email saying that even Chase had to raise their rates. So it's more than bupkis, but not a lot more. So hold on.
Well, as long as we keep some money
Yes.
with the mid-sized banks, I guess we help out the economy at large. It's just that everyone is moving the money to the higher yielding treasury-linked deposits that are available at either Stiff or at Vanguard, Fidelity, and all the other guys. That's why these
Well,
banks are hurting.
for next year, and I know that the Board of Finance did a calculation also. My understanding from listening to the meeting that their initial calculation was suggested was a little bit optimistic. And so they came out with a different number. I know that Jen and Joan did a recalculation based upon the current market rates, and they came out about moved it up to about 1.65 or something, but it's over 1.7 million now. And I'm only using rough numbers because I don't have the numbers right in front of me. And so that's part of that will be reduced because we're now recording that we're going to have a lot more income. And so at least out of that 4 million, 1.2 million of it, we would not expect to see next year. It's hard to go much higher because there's not much you can trust of what comes out of Powell's mouth. He told all the banks that he wasn't going above 2% and went to 4% in a year. So, and while he says that he's not going to cut any rates in the foreseeable calendar year, we don't know what will be happening come January 24. So, it's built upon current rates. May we anticipate another rate? We had that conversation last time. So we'll see rates go up again. We're keeping our treasury short term. Part of it's because we have to spend money. And a lot of expenditures are coming up in June. Just a reminder that teachers have the option to take their entire summer pay in June, as opposed to getting it on the, semi-monthly payments that they're getting. And a lot of people take that option. So, it's based upon cash flow, but Joan's been working with Jen and Monica to watch those and pursue other avenues. And for the longest time, and this makes no sense, but for the longest time, based upon Wayne, the town Wayne wasn't comfortable with investing in treasuries. And so Monica took the lead to make that change. And, in conversations I've had with Joan, and nobody else did that in all the years
Great.
before.
That's great.
So,
You don't want to, I mean, you have to listen to the lawyers sometimes, but, as far as treasuries is concerned, I mean, if you want to make an investment with Goldman Sachs in a real estate trust, I can see the lawyers coming in, but when you buy treasuries, I never saw the point.
no,
But
we agree.
I'm done with that part.
Okay, so are we ready to vote on the revised resolution of 23-13, which will be 2,640,000, not the one that was distributed? So all those in favor, say aye, raise your hand. That's good. We're good to go. That brings us 8-0. Welcome, Louisa, for joining us. Let's see. All right, next. I'm just going to discuss these briefly. We're not going to vote on them tonight, again, because I'd like to have more members of the committee here. But the first part of 23-14 will be the resolved of the appropriation of $4,667,767 to the reserve fund. There was some capital adjustments that were made during the course of the year. During the budget time, the Norotan Heights Fire Department retaining wall maybe it was moved out, and that might either come back to the RTM as a separate item, or might be paid for from ARPA funds, because there'll be some movement in ARPA. What Ralph was talking about last meeting that we had is that there was some estimates made for the sewer projects, and some of them came in, at least the first one that we have the full study on that's been released, it came in substantially higher than what we anticipated. It came in at $6 million, and the original estimate was about 1.5. So there's some decisions that need to be made as to whether or not we're going to do it, whether or not we're going to bond for the full thing or partially bond for it. And so that's part of the reason why the Board of Selectmen is reconstituting the ARPA committee to review and reallocate. I've been told, this hasn't been confirmed by legal counsel yet, but it's being interpreted that the RTM, even though we voted on each of the individual items, and we were initially told that if there were changes, it would have to come back to the RTM. we're being told that it doesn't have to come back to the RTM. It only needs to go to the Board of Finance to make those changes. We'll hear more about that later, but we will. I will be replacing Martha Banks on the ARPA committee, so we'll address those things. The next item is the appropriation for the selectmen's operating budget. That's part B. We're going to do the lead on that. I'm working on the same thing that we did last year, which is with Kate, core versus growth. And when we went through the analysis, there really isn't a lot of growth this year. Because some of the things we knew were coming and it's illegal. So the new fire inspector is a core business, even though we're adding somebody, and we're going to explain this, but it's really the core business. The items of growth, and Kate and I still have to discuss this, is the new gentleman for emergency management, which is really, we have a job that's part-time and it allows the assistant fire marshal who fills in both roles to now continue in just the fire marshal role, which we need. And we'll have the emergency management person there handling that. And they'll do anything if we need FEMA reports or other things like that. We have, we really don't have a lot of major items that are coming in. They are adding bodies, but most of them are to the existing businesses that they have. So I'm preparing the sheet with Kate. We have the first cut of it, and I'll send that out later this week so that everybody on the committee has it. And then the next meeting, we'll have further discussion on this stuff. Is there anybody who has comments on the Board of Selectmen budget? Bert? Anybody?
I just want to say one thing, Jack. It's not a criticism of your leadership. It's just we need to have people here. I mean, we're a very important committee always, but especially during the budget cycle. And I can't believe that we don't have a quorum at a time like this. So I think that all of us, we have to go out and reach out to the other members of FNB, and we gotta be there. Okay. I mean, it's not like in September or October when we all vote to accept a grant from some organization. This is about the budget. I can't believe we don't have a quorum tonight.
Well,
That's it.
I did hear from 3 of our other members, which brings us up to which would bring us up to 10. 3 people I have not heard from, but just for information, Jenny's on a plane flying back from San Francisco as we speak, and be in at 12. Milan and Barry both had meetings that came up that changed certain things. So I agree with you. That's why we're not voting on these things tonight. But I also want you to have the detail that'll be presented. And, at our final meeting, we can bring in, Kate for a little bit since we're virtual, and the Board of Ed at the same time for that meeting on that Wednesday, just so that if there's any other questions, we can go through it. The Board of Ed budget is 114 mil plus change. They did a really good job in bringing this down this year, and did some cuts that are there. But in working with Rich, I really have to look, because when we're doing core versus growth, even though the SSOs were in operation this year, it really counts as growth to next year's budget because it wasn't authorized in the current year's budget. So it's not that it slides under the defense, same with the director of mental health. So I just need to reconcile those with him. Part of it is just salary increases also, but we'll get that done. It is interesting because if they add staff on special ed, because that is a core business, or you need to add a teacher at an elementary school, that's core business. So that stays with just increases in the core. But these other two things were new, and we'll address that. I'll meet with Rich and get that done. We add the two together. We end up with a mill rate of 1762. We're going to, and Werner, I will send you the breakdown of everything with how we go from the original grand list to what the adjustments are to what goes on, because I know you always ask me that every year, even when you were on F&B. So I'll get that out to everyone. I'm just trying to organize the documents that we got. But the mill rate's broken into two parts this year. So the first part of the mill rate is for the town operations that includes Board of Ed operating, Board of Selectmen operating, and debt service. The next part of it, where we're taking that 4.6 million, we're contributing 2.6 million, and we end up with a number of about $2 million. That is being moved directly from the taxes into the reserve fund this year. And Jen broke out what it was last year, so we can watch what's going on. So the first part is a mill rate of 1742, and then we're adding 20 basis points for the taxes associated with the net amount remaining from capital and paying for that. So we'll go through that. We'll have the typical 500,000 that we do every year. We will do an introduction on the reserve fund, the other reserves, but this year Public Works will report on the sewer operations fund, the assessment fund, the sewer capital fund, as well as the two parking lot funds, and Park and Rec will report on the 1.4 million recreation program fund. I will also mention there is a Great Island Special Revenue Fund. We approved it in our June 22nd meeting when we approved the purchase. There's really been no changes to that fund. And unlike it's more like the sewer and the parking fund at this time, that it will not be swept into the general fund because taxpayer funds aren't being used for their operations. They're supposed to be self-sufficient. Whether or not and how long it stays will based upon the governance and everything else that's going on. But there's no reason to approve anything for Great Island in this year's budget because it's staying the same. And so as what the estimated amount, I think it was 420,000 was to begin with, and going from there. So we'll cover that again. The last part of the budget, and Jenny, who does a great job proofreading, read the Bond Council resolution, and there were two bond issuance. This next item that we're going to do, which is, I don't have the number. Oh, here it is 2315. Can I have somebody move that? We will vote on that tonight. Who wants to move this? I have Louisa and Beth. Okay. So every year we authorize the Board of Finance to refund certain of the town's bonds and authorizing issuance if they find a better rate or for whatever reasons they find. Tough in the rising environment, but they still get authorized. In reading the bond resolution, 2 years were in the resolution for which the town has already refinanced those bonds in 2020. So spoke to Jen about that. We came to a decision that it has no harm in keeping those 2 years in the resolution because we can't refund them anyhow since they've already been refunded, refinanced and that. And we'll just make note of it for next year's resolution that those 2 years drop out. And if we did make a change to this resolution, it would have to go back to bond council and have to go through that whole thing. And really, there's no effect on this resolution by leaving those two in. So we're leaving it in, but that just should answer if anybody else decides to read the full thing and say, wait, didn't we refinance these two issues? And the answer is yes, we did. Hats off to Jenny for actually catching that as she was flying back from Japan. So I guess she had time to read. So with that, I think we're all familiar with what this resolution is for 119,705, 119,705,000. Any further discussion on this? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, good. That passes 8-0. Last thing is I sent out the revised minutes, and I decided to keep something in because I thought Jenny had a good sense of humor. If you read the sign off, she signs it Jenny Pollyanna Schultz.
Yeah.
So I thought I thought that was hysterical. And so that's going to be in the final minutes that we're voting on. I need somebody to move the minutes. I have Warner and I have Beth. Oh, I'll take Burke because Beth, you've been active today. And then, are there any changes to that? Seeing none, let's. Are we ready to vote? All in favor, say aye. Raise your hand. That's good to go. That passes unanimously. Last thing is there any new business to discuss for that? Would you like to have Kate and Duke and Adley at our next meeting to discuss their budgets, or up to you?
I
Do you
think
feel
the topic which we were, I thought we were going to discuss tonight, and maybe we can have them come and discuss is the policy issues.
The budget review issue. Okay, yes, I'm sorry. Let's talk about that. So does anybody want to start off?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I spent some time reviewing the meetings. I didn't get through the most recent, fully through the last recent meeting, but I think in concept, I think we would be in agreement with some of the major points that were brought up by the Board of Ed, which was essentially what amounts to a reassessment of their own procedures. And I think the point of inflection was the fact that during the process, the administration was peppered with, I think, 240 questions about the budget, and they felt that was too many questions coming from too many places all at once, and was very inefficient. Many of the topics were redundant, and I frankly I concur. I think that it's if there's a better way of handling that questioning process, I would welcome it. I think we would all welcome it. I think one of the things that was interesting is that they just were trying to find a way to bifurcate the policy issues and policy discussions, which have accompanied budgets in the past, with the actual financial discussions and the numbers, and try to find a way to take those policy decisions and have them discussed earlier in the cycle. And I think in concept that sounds great, and I think we'd like to support that. However, as I was discussing with Beth earlier today, policy does have a financial impact. If somebody decides to add a program, which as a matter of policy, that's going to cost money, and therefore it has a budget impact. So while I think some of the why are we adding a program here or a program there, or paring down a program here or a program there, those policy discussions could probably be handled earlier and get them out of the January, February, March budget process. That would be welcome. I think also that would spread the process out a little more thinly or across a greater period of time, which may be less burdensome than we all find budget season to be during the wintertime. I think John Cini was repeatedly talked about wanting to make sure that all the stakeholders have appropriate feedback into the process and input into the process. So I don't think there's any issue there. Although the way that the RTM's input was characterized was if I'm correct, thumbs up or thumbs down on what the Board of Ed and Board of Finance brought to it. I think that our input is much more detailed than that and needs to be. And that may just be semantics, but it was something that caught my ear. So other major points, I think the one of the things they talked about was the art.
Peter, you're muted.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I wish somebody had yelled earlier about that. So I apologize.
No, you
again,
just
Only for a sentence.
all right. I don't know how that happened. But there was an initiative to have our questions, the RTM's questions, I should say, not just ours, but also education's, be sent to the board as a whole, not to the administration. And that way the Board of Ed could be able to handle them and try to reduce the workload on the administration. And I guess I don't disagree with that. But again, there was a discussion of what roles should different groups have, and I think they really didn't discuss what they thought our role should be. I think we know what our role should be, and that is we want to know how our money is being spent. And sometimes it involves a lot of questions and details, which I think they'll end up supporting, and I don't think that's going to change. And so I guess in concept, I think most of what was proposed in the meeting from a month or so ago is somewhat consistent with what we would agree to be relevant way to streamline things and maybe take some of the sting out of the budget season, so to speak, and spread that burden earlier in the process, which I think we would upon. But again, there was a increased emphasis on having time and structure for all the feedback from the RTM. But again, I think they wanted to get that into the process. I think, again, another practical issue from this past year was that we, from the RTM, had already provided hundreds of questions prior to the Board of Ed actually technically receiving the superintendent's budget, which they thought was a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem, which I understand. So, but again, it's the while policy issues may be spread out during the year, earlier in the year, maybe in the fall. Like for example, the annual tour of the schools, which is a de facto review of capital projects, both past and current, might be done in the fall, because that way, when we got to the budget process, we would already have those issues sort of in our mind. So again, I think that's in general, it's all positive, but I think we need to make sure that we are exercising our diligence over budget issues with the Board of Ed, and continue to do so. But I don't think any of the things that we're discussing are going to cut back on that.
Well, I'm going to give some corrections, and then I'll go to you, Beth. First of all, I'm not sure that they truly understand what the role of the RTM is, and we have a good working relationship, and John and Duke and I had a good meeting, but it's not a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or we can cut.
Jack, I know that. I wasn't saying that it was.
No.
That's what they said.
I'm putting this on record so that they hear it. The RTM has the right to approve a budget. We can make a total dollar amount cut to their budget, or we can deny their budget. And if it gets denied, which happens in several towns where RTMs are, they are stuck with their prior year's budget until such time that they come back to the RTM and it gets approved. So I'm not saying that we're going to do that, but I just want everyone here to understand those are the three options. Number two, I actually said that the consideration that I wanted was to be no different than what we have on the Board of Selectmen. And I actually looked at how the Board of Selectmen modified their budget when they did this about 3-4 years ago. And part of what they did is cut out some of the smaller cost centers that don't change from year to year and were taking up time, and they focused on the larger cost centers. Or should something be happening that we need? I think the policy is their own internal workings on what they need to get done and how they've been speaking to their administration. Because all too often, and you heard David Brown frequently throughout the budget saying, why am I first hearing about this now? We don't have a presentation, or it's going to be a short presentation instead of one that allows for the full discussion of what's going on. So that's an internal thing. But I think that those presentations personally should also include some financial analysis, so that it's not just this is the policy, we're going to start teaching Romanian as a language. Well, here's the cost of teaching Romanian over the next couple of years, should be part of that policy discussion. And I think that there's members of the board that expect that. So then if the decision is to teach Romanian, then when those numbers flow into the budget, they have it. One of the other things they're talking about is doing a better 5-year plan. I don't like being lumped in with all the other questions. I counted the questions from the F&B committee, and we may have had about the least. We talked a little bit about certain concepts of supporting board members, such as talking about policy earlier, talking about, tightening up certain things, things that Dennis had mentioned, things that John had mentioned, and was supportive on that. I don't think we asked as many questions in that. The other thing that I mentioned, and so I don't like being lumped in. There were over 250 questions, and I thought that that was excessive. We're all in agreement with that. It's excessive, they're duplicate, and even some of the questions that came up have either no budget relevance, or if you've just been following the Board of Ed, you should know the answer to them already. They shouldn't have even been raised. So I have full support on that issue. I did mention to them that, as I'm just doing a comparison, not telling them what they should do or shouldn't do. That's up to their board, how they want to operate. But when we go to the Board of Selectmen, and we're talking, let's say, about Public Works, and somebody, the Board of Selectmen do their first questions after Ed does a presentation with Kate. But if we have an additional follow-up question at that time, they give us an answer right then and there. And on the same thing, even though the Board of Ed could be a little bit more complicated, but you do have Rich, you do have Badley, and you do have the department head doing the presentation. These are their numbers. If there's something new that's there, I figured that an answer could be done just orally right then and there and have it resolved. The other question that you made, Peter, and this is possibly a mistake that people have been making. From the time I've done this, all of the questions that I ask go to the chair of the Board of Ed. It's not being asked of the administration. That's where it's supposed to go through. And so if they want to have, and I think that we do that, but if they go through and then Duke and the board, who is a chair in the board, then decide which questions deserve to be answered in that, I think that's totally fair and honest. I also was very uncomfortable. We can give high level things, and I think that you'll hear John say that it was very helpful to the board's actions this year to hear from the Board of Finance, the RTM Education, and F&B that their starting budget was high, and that gave them reason to work on it, and they did a phenomenal job working with all parties. But the Board of Selectmen gets their budget no different than the Board of Ed. Both boards get their book before the presentation. It's Kate's budget until the Board of Selectmen review, and when she gives the presentation of the budget, it's the first time those board members are hearing that presentation. Same thing happens in the Board of Ed. They get the books beforehand. If Adley then does a presentation to the board, that's no different than the Board of Selectmen hearing it for the first time. And, I just think that for the most part, those are fair comments. They should decide what they're going to answer. If they can answer something, then that would help. And it's recorded, so you don't have to write it down. 250 plus questions were outrageous. There shouldn't be that many on it. The duplication is outrageous. The things that weren't part of the budget was outrageous. As long as we have a right to ask some questions, and maybe it's a high level, maybe our questions are, during your discussion of the budget, can you pursue this? So I'm not asking for a direct answer, but I'm asking them to consider doing it. But the board should have an opportunity to ask their questions first, which they do during Super Saturday. And then the other groups come in. John offered certain suggestions on the Board of Ed Finance Committee, all of which were reasonable. So I think that they're still looking to have a working relationship with the partners of the Board of Finance, RTMs, and the two RTM committees. So, hopefully certain things does change, so all the policy is done. That's internal to them beforehand. I think the tour of the schools in March was always too late. The horse had already left the barn. So having it earlier, I think, is great. And most of the suggestions where they're going to be talking about, earlier on in their process, I think helps them as a board and also helps anybody reviewing it. Because we can listen to those discussions and should be listening to those discussions throughout the course of the year. So, if they're talking about, again, I'm going to use the concept that, we're going to teach Romanian now as a language. It's our responsibility to also listen to those board meetings where they're discussing this, as opposed to waiting for a budget time and asking questions that were answered in prior board meetings. I mean, that's as much as our responsibility as well. And I think that those who follow the Board of Ed agree with that. So, Beth, I cut you off before, so.
Well, a lot of what you said was along the lines of what I was going to say. I mean, a good deal of the speech we gave in January or February or whenever that was actually talking about the process where it would be nice to hear things far in advance of budget season, because by the time you get it in the budget and it's sort of a surprise and you haven't really heard much about it, it's good to have had the presentation beforehand rather than post approval. What that does mean, and this is true, it's going to be true for everybody, is that you need to then focus more on the Board of Ed year round rather than just, very intensely in January and February. It means that a lot of the budgetary impacts of things will be discussed far before budgets, what we consider to be budget season. So it just means, Peter and I'll be watching all the meetings, and if things are coming up, we will need to discuss that in advance rather than just in a great big dump in January.
Yeah, and report to us on it. I mean, I think that's good. Like, I know that you and Peter get the Board of Ed agendas no different than I do. I understand what's going on financially because I look at the reports that Rich prepares to the Finance Committee, and without question, they're outstanding.
Oh, God bless Rich.
Yeah. But it gives a good idea of what's going on during the course of the year, which makes life a lot easier, even for the budget. And if I do have a question, what I do typically is I'll call Duke and say, hey, do you mind? I don't typically call Adley or Rich without giving Duke a heads up. Because that's just how I was always trained to do it from the time that John Bolton was the chair of the Board of Ed, which goes back a little bit. Since Bert has already said earlier in this meeting that I've been around for a long time. But yeah, we have to review a budget, but it's also our responsibility to follow what's going on in the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed during the course of the year. You can't just wait for them to come out on it. And a lot of what happens in the Board of Selectmen, we've already heard about, or one of the other committees hear about, and that. There is a slight advantage on the Board of Selectmen with the RTM. In most of the committees, the department heads meet with that committee. So like Ed Gentile meet with Public Works, and they are already split up into various component parts. Or the Park and Rec work hand in hand with Pam and their commission. Same thing with land use management. And I'm probably leaving people out, but Jeremy will show up 2 or 3 times a year and discuss things. So, when things are coming down the road, besides what's happening just in the Board of Selectmen, the committees, rightfully so, are following what's going on in their area of expertise or purview. It's a little different on the Board of Ed based upon the structure. Not that any of us want to be calling up somebody in curriculum and having a conversation. I can't imagine that at all, and I don't think it's appropriate for us. But yeah, I mean, and if there is a question that you have, you can give Duke a call or send him an email and go from there. I'm not one to say you have to go through me on everything. I mean, if we start to inundate him, that's fine. But I think that the Board of Ed has come to maybe 2 or 3 of our meetings during the course of the year. One was the union contract that then somebody wanted to talk about budget that I didn't. But if it's a union contract, we'll bring them in because we need to hear from them. So, sometimes we didn't do it this year, but the prior year we did a review of the prior year's budget and the closeouts just so we had a better understanding of certain things. But we also had a very good meeting on the SSOs and the Director of Mental Health that we had planned even before they went to the Board of Finance. And yet it was a really positive meeting from the feedback that I got from people. So we don't bug them to come to our meetings. And in fact, just as long as we have the knowledge and that, they can stay home. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, just, we've done our job and research that we can move things through. And if we don't, then we can invite them in. So that's always been my philosophy. So, we don't see a lot of Kate and Jen showing up at our meetings because we already have the information. Like we need Don Anderson to discuss what's going on a police vote, or we need Jeremy or to do it. But even on the last meeting when Jeremy presented to PZNH, that meeting was so good. I just said, here's the meeting, guys, watch it. And we don't need Jeremy because he answered virtually anything we were going to have to ask anyway. And I'm not for having town employees have to stay here longer than they need to. They have enough work to do what their main job is. So yeah, we'll have to see how it works. If we do have concerns or there's certain things that when you review it, if you have questions on, John has an open door that we can discuss during the summer. I know that Jim sent him an email saying that there might be some discussions on that. But the other thing is, I think for me, I like knowing what the Board of Finance wants for guidance, because that's what we're working off of also. We're not setting guidance here. We could in our own minds, but they but quite honestly, for most of the guidance that Jim has given, I'm personally, I'm not in disagreement with what he's saying. It's reasonable, and then understand that there's some flexibility to it. So anyway, any other discussions on this? Nope. Okay. So now I can take a motion to adjourn. I'll take Bert and I'll take Louisa, and all those in favor, raise your hand. And it is 8:63, and we are done.